He signed the papers without looking up. That was the part Serena Vale remembered most. Not the cold marble of the kitchen counter where the documents sat. Not the lawyer who wouldn't meet her eyes. Not even the sound of Damon's pen scratching across the final page like he was approving a takeout order. It was that he never looked up. 5 years of marriage, and he couldn't spare her 2 seconds of eye contact on the day he ended it. "You can take the gray suitcase," Damon said, still reading something on his phone. "Leave the Louis Vuitton. That was a gift from a client." The lawyer shifted in his chair. Serena said nothing. She walked upstairs, packed the gray suitcase, and came back down in 11 minutes. She didn't take the jewelry. She didn't take the watch he'd given her for their 3rd anniversary, the one she'd worn every day for 2 years until she noticed he'd given his assistant the same one. She left the credit cards on the entryway table, fanned out like a hand of cards she was folding. Damon was on a call by the time she reached the front door. She let herself out. That was how it ended, or how Damon believed it ended. He had already moved on before the door clicked shut behind her. He had a dinner reservation at 8, a woman who laughed at everything he said, and the clean, uncomplicated satisfaction of a problem solved. He was still on that call, laughing at something, when the helicopters came. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who believed your silence meant you had nothing left, stay with this story. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, because what happens in the next 2 hours will change how you think about quiet people forever. The morning had started the way most mornings started in the Voss household, with Damon performing his life for an audience that wasn't there. He came downstairs at 7 sharp in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's rent, talking on his phone before his feet hit the bottom step, gesturing with one hand at the housekeeper as if she were a prop in the background of his own movie. Serena had been up since 5. She'd made coffee, read something, sat at the kitchen window watching the pale light come up over the back lawn. When Damon walked in, she didn't turn around. "The Harlow deal closes at noon," he said into the phone. "Tell Renata I need the amended contracts on my desk by 10, not 10:30. 10. He poured himself coffee without looking at the cup, spilled a small amount on the counter, and walked out of the kitchen still talking. He didn't acknowledge the coffee. He didn't acknowledge Serena. That was Tuesday. Wednesday was the same. Thursday had a variation. He looked at her once across the dining room table when she asked him to pass the salt, and he said, "You're wearing that again?" in the tone of a man observing something mildly unfortunate, like a stain on the carpet, before returning to his phone. She had been wearing a cream-colored blouse. It was clean. It was hers. He'd bought her 3 designer pieces in their first year of marriage and spent the next 4 years quietly punishing her for not wearing them enough. As though her clothes were a reflection of his taste and her plainness was a personal insult delivered daily. Serena passed him the salt herself. She had been doing that for 5 years, absorbing the small insults, translating his contempt into something she could live inside of without breaking. She was good at it. She'd had practice long before Damon Voss, though he didn't know that, and wouldn't have cared to. The divorce papers arrived on a Friday. She'd known they were coming. She'd found the draft in his home office 3 weeks earlier, not by snooping. She'd been looking for a stapler. And she'd stood in the doorway of that room for a long moment reading the first page before setting it back exactly where it had been. She'd made dinner that night. She'd slept in the same bed. She'd let the weeks pass the way she'd let most things pass in this house, quietly, without signaling that she knew. The lawyer's name was Kettner. He was a small man with good posture and the practiced neutrality of someone paid to witness other people's worst moments without reacting. He sat at the kitchen table with his briefcase open and explained, in calm, sequential sentences, that Damon was offering a settlement of $200,000 and a transitional housing allowance covering 3 months. "That's generous," Damon said. He was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, watching her. Serena looked at the papers. "No alimony?" she said. "You weren't working," Damon said. "You don't have a career to return to. The 200 covers the gap while you figure out your next step." "What about the house in Carmel?" "That was purchased before the marriage." He said it the way you'd say something obvious to someone slow. "It's in my name, always was." Kettner cleared his throat softly, which was the only human thing he did the entire morning. Serena looked at the number again. 200,000 for 5 years. She thought about the dinners she'd organized, the clients she'd charmed at events Damon couldn't have pulled off without a presentable wife standing next to him saying the right things. She thought about the weekend she'd spent nursing him through a fever so bad he'd been delirious, and he'd woken up on the third day and said, "You look tired," like an observation about the weather. She thought about the morning she'd overheard him on the phone with a woman named Petra, laughing in a way he hadn't laughed with Serena in 2 years. She thought about all of it, and then she signed the papers. Damon looked surprised. He hadn't expected it to be that easy. "That's it?" he said. "That's it," she said. She set the pen down on the table and stood up. She thanked Kettner, which seemed to unsettle him slightly. She walked upstairs, took 11 minutes, came back with the gray suitcase. Damon was already on his phone. She left the credit cards on the entryway table. She looked around the foyer once. The Italian marble. The chandelier he'd imported from a hotel that had gone bankrupt. The oil painting of a coastline she'd never been to. And she felt nothing she hadn't already felt, so she opened the door and walked out into the clean morning air. She was halfway across the front lawn when she heard it. A low thudding pulse at first, distant enough to be confused with traffic or machinery, and then rapidly not distant at all. The sound grew with the speed of something that had been approaching for a long time and only now chose to arrive. She stopped walking. She didn't look up immediately. She set her suitcase down on the grass first, carefully, like she was leaving it somewhere she might come back for it. Then she looked up. The helicopter was black and enormous, dropping toward the back of the property with the unhurried precision of something that owned the air it moved through. Then a second one appeared to the south. Then, distantly, a third. Behind her, she heard the front door open. Damon's voice. "What in the—" He came out onto the step with his phone still in his hand, and he looked at the sky, and for the first time in 5 years, Serena saw his face do something uncontrolled. It was only a flicker. His jaw went loose, his eyes showed white at the edges, before the performance of composure reasserted itself. "The hell is this?" he said. Around the perimeter of the property, cars had materialized. Black, unmarked, pulled up along the street, and at the side entrance, with the mechanical, coordinated calm of people who had done this before, in worse places. Men in dark suits moved along the fence line. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. The helicopter found the back lawn and descended onto it like it had been invited. Damon came down off the step. He walked across the lawn with his phone raised like a weapon, jaw set, the bearing of a man who had walked into rooms full of people afraid of him and expected this to be the same. "This is private property," he said loudly, to no one in particular. "I don't care who you are. You are on private property." The helicopter's doors opened. The man who stepped out was not large. That was the first surprise. Lucien DeMarco was average height, somewhere in his mid-60s, with the kind of face that had absorbed decades of difficult information without showing most of it. He wore a dark suit and no tie, and he moved across the lawn with the gait of a man for whom urgency had always been a choice rather than a condition. 2 men followed him at a respectful distance and then stopped. Everyone else stayed where they were. He walked past Damon without looking at him. He walked toward Serena. She hadn't moved since the helicopter landed. She was standing next to her gray suitcase in the middle of the lawn with the morning sun coming over her shoulder. And she was watching this man cross the grass toward her with an expression that was difficult to read. It wasn't fear. It wasn't relief. It was something older and more complicated, the expression of a person who had been keeping a door closed for a long time and could feel it being opened from the other side. Lucien DeMarco stopped 2 feet in front of her. He looked at her face for a moment, not speaking. Then he reached out and put a hand on her shoulder, and something in him that had been held tight seemed to release very slightly, like a cord being cut. "Princess," he said, "it's time to come home." Damon Voss watched this from 15 feet away. He watched the woman he had dismissed as having no one, no family, no resources, no significance beyond whatever reflected status she'd borrowed from his name, watched her step forward into an embrace with Lucien DeMarco. And the name took a moment to land, the way a large noise sometimes takes a moment to register as real. Then it landed. DeMarco. The name that moved through certain circles the way electrical current moved through wire. Not seen, but felt, and capable of stopping a heart. "I'm sorry," Damon said. The composure had gone somewhere. "I'm sorry, do you two know each other?" Nobody answered him. Lucian pulled back from Serena and looked at her again, his hand still on her arm. "Are you all right?" he said. It was quiet enough that Damon had to strain to catch it. "I'm fine," she said. "Did he hurt you?" A pause. "Not in any way that leaves a mark." Lucian's expression didn't change exactly, but something settled in it, some final decision that had been pending. He turned then and looked at Damon Voss for the first time. It was a brief look, the kind of look a man gives a thing he's decided what to do with. "Mr. Voss," he said. Damon straightened. He was still holding his phone. He had the look of a man trying to locate a conversation he knew how to have and finding nothing familiar. "Mr. DeMarco, I'm not sure what's happening here, but if there's something I can help clarify—" "There's nothing," Lucian said. "We won't need anything from you." He turned back to Serena. "The car is at the gate when you're ready." She nodded. She reached down and picked up the gray suitcase. She didn't look at Damon, not out of coldness exactly, but with the quality of someone who has finished a chapter and does not feel the need to reread it. She walked beside Lucian DeMarco across the back lawn toward the gate at the far end of the property, and the men in suits adjusted their positions as she moved, a quiet geometric rearrangement that made it clear what she was to them. Damon stood on the lawn of his house. He stood there after the gate closed. He stood there as the helicopters lifted, the sound cresting and then diminishing into the distance. He stood there until the cars were gone from the street and the perimeter was empty and the morning had returned to its ordinary sounds: birds, traffic, someone's sprinkler 2 houses over. Then he went inside and sat at the kitchen table where the divorce papers still lay, and he looked at the number he had written on Serena Vale's life, $200,000, and felt for the first time in a long time something that did not have a clean name. His phone rang. It was his assistant. He let it ring. It rang again. This time it was Petra. He answered. "Did you sign?" she said. "Yeah," he said. "So it's done?" He looked at the empty entryway table where Serena had left the credit cards. "It's done." "Good," Petra said. "I was thinking dinner at Sorrel tonight. They finally have a reservation." "Sure," he said. "Yeah, Sorrel." He hung up. He sat in the kitchen for a while longer, long enough for the light to shift, long enough to notice that the coffee he'd spilled on the counter that morning had dried into a dark ring that no one had wiped up. He thought about Lucian DeMarco's eyes, not the look the man had given him, which had been brief and damaging, but the look he'd given Serena. The particular quality of it, the way a person looked at something they had feared losing for a very long time. He thought about the way she'd said, "Not in any way that leaves a mark." He thought about that for a long time. He thought about it through dinner at Sorrel, where Petra laughed at everything he said and touched his arm, and he watched the candle on the table between them and did the math in a new way, running backward through 5 years, through the investors who'd come through Serena's connections, through the charity gala where she'd smoothed over a contract dispute by spending 45 minutes with a man's wife, through 24 moments he had cataloged as background noise, and was only now beginning to suspect had been load-bearing walls. "You're quiet," Petra said. "I'm thinking," he said. "About what?" He picked up his wine. "Nothing," he said. "Work." But he wasn't thinking about work. He was thinking about a woman who had stood in the middle of a lawn with a gray suitcase and watched a man step out of a helicopter, and who had not looked surprised, who had not looked relieved or frightened or overwhelmed, who had looked, if anything, like someone finally being returned to the correct address. He didn't sleep well that night. He was still awake at 2 in the morning when his phone started with the notifications. A low vibration at first, then persistent, then the particular escalating urgency of something that was not going to stop. He picked up the phone and opened it and looked at the screen. And what he saw there kept him sitting up in the dark for the rest of the night, reading and rereading, his face in the phone's cold light becoming a different face than the one Serena Vale had lived with for 5 years. Different in the way that faces become when the story a man has told himself about who he is meets the story everyone else has been telling about him all along, and the two versions fail to match. They failed badly. By 2 in the morning, Damon had read the same article 11 times. Not because he didn't understand it, because he kept hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something he could survive. The headline wasn't even dramatic. That was the worst part. It was a financial news outlet, the kind nobody read unless they were already afraid. A dry headline about shell corporations, beneficial ownership disclosures, and a web of holding companies traced back to a parent entity registered in Luxembourg. The article was 4 years old. It had been published once and gone nowhere, buried under the 10,000 pieces of content produced every day that nobody clicked on because nobody knew to look. Someone had found it. Someone had sent it to 16 different accounts in the last 3 hours, all of them journalists, 2 of them federal correspondents. One of them, a deputy editor at a newspaper Damon had been quoted in 14 times as a source on urban development. He sat in the dark bedroom with Petra breathing beside him and read the article again. The Shell Corporation named in paragraph 3 was one he recognized. He'd recognized it the first time too, though it had taken him a moment. It was buried under 2 layers of holding structure, named something generic, something that had never made him look twice. He had signed documents connected to that entity 4 years ago through an intermediary and had told himself what men in his position always told themselves: that the money was clean by the time it reached him, that the distance between source and destination was sufficient, that what he didn't know couldn't touch him. He got up. He went to the kitchen. He stood at the counter where Serena had made coffee that morning, and he called his attorney. Not Kettner, his other attorney, the one he paid to be available at 3 in the morning. The attorney answered on the second ring. That meant he'd been awake too. "You've seen it," Damon said. "I've seen it," Marcus Hale said. His voice had the controlled flatness of a man actively suppressing a more honest reaction. "When did you know?" "I didn't know anything. That's what I'm telling you." A pause. "Damon." "I didn't know." "No," he said, louder, and heard how it sounded and lowered his voice. "Not the full picture. I knew there were investors with complicated structures. I didn't know who was behind the Luxembourg entity." The article names the DeMarco family as beneficial owners. I know what the article says. "So when this woman walked out of your house this morning and Lucien DeMarco stepped out of a helicopter, I didn't know." He pressed his palm flat against the counter. "I didn't know she was his. I didn't know any of it." Hale was quiet for a moment. Through the phone, Damon could hear him breathing, deliberate and slow, the way a man breathed when he was deciding how much of the truth to deliver at once. "The article going out to those contacts tonight, that's not coincidence." "No," Damon said. "That's an opening move." "I know what it is, Marcus." "Then you understand that if there's a connection between your capital structure and that holding entity, and federal correspondents are looking at it tonight, what do I do?" Damon said. Another pause, longer. "You let me make some calls in the morning. You say nothing to anyone, and you do not—" Hale stopped. "Is anyone with you?" "Petra's here." A sound from the other end of the phone that wasn't quite a word. "She doesn't know anything," Damon said. "Damon, is Petra Solis someone whose discretion you would bet your life on?" He looked toward the bedroom door. He could see the edge of the bedside lamp through the gap, still on. "I'll call you in the morning," he said, and ended the call. He stood in the kitchen for a while. The coffee ring from that morning was still on the counter. He wiped it with a cloth and then stood there holding the cloth, looking at the place where it had been. He thought about Serena finding the divorce papers in his office. He'd always assumed she hadn't looked closely. She'd returned them to exactly the position he'd left them, and said nothing, and he'd taken her silence for obliviousness, because that was the most comfortable explanation. Now he turned the memory over and found a different shape inside it. She'd known for 3 weeks. She'd made dinner. She'd slept in the same bed. She'd sat across from Kettner and signed the papers in under 4 minutes, and thanked the attorney and packed 11 minutes worth of belongings and left. She hadn't asked for anything. At the time, he'd read it as defeat, the quiet acceptance of a woman who had no leverage and knew it. He was beginning to understand that it was something else entirely. By morning, 3 of the journalists who'd received the article had published follow-up pieces. 2 were speculative, connecting the disclosure to the DeMarco family's name, raising questions, careful not to assert what they couldn't yet prove. The 3rd piece was not speculative. The 3rd piece had documents. Damon read it at the kitchen table with his second cup of coffee going cold beside him and felt the floor of his understanding give way in increments, like ice failing under weight, each crack sequential and irreversible. The document showed a capital flow. A series of investments made through a holding company, the Luxembourg entity, into a development firm that had seeded 3 of Damon's earliest projects, his first hotel, the Carmel property. A mixed-use development in the financial district that had made his name in this city 12 years ago and that he had told the story of 100 times at dinners, at panels, in magazine profiles, the scrappy self-made developer who had bet on himself and won. The money had come from somewhere. He'd known it came from somewhere, in the way a man could know a thing without letting it fully form in his mind. He'd taken the investment through an intermediary, a broker named Cassius, who'd operated in the space between institutional finance and the kinds of relationships that didn't get written down. And Cassius had told him the source was a European family office with diversified holdings. And Damon had believed it because he'd wanted to believe it, and the checks had cleared and the projects had built, and 12 years had passed, and he had told himself the story of the scrappy, self-made man so many times that he'd stopped being able to feel the seams. His phone rang. It was his bank's relationship manager, whose name was Patrick Shields, and who called Damon twice a year for lunch and had once described their professional relationship, at a particularly good lunch, as bulletproof. Patrick did not sound like a man who had used that word. "Damon," he said, "I need you to come in." "Today?" "This morning. I'm sorry. There are people here I didn't invite, and I need you to come in." He went in. He wore the charcoal suit he'd worn the day before because it was the first thing his hand touched, and he wasn't thinking clearly enough to make a different choice. He drove himself, which he never did, because the idea of being in a car with another person, someone who might ask him questions or simply sit there knowing, was unbearable. The bank's offices were on the 14th floor of a building Damon had once tried to acquire. He rode the elevator remembering that the particular pleasure of having wanted something in this building, and the memory felt like it belonged to someone else. There were two men in the conference room he didn't recognize. Patrick stood near the window, looking like a man who had been told something he wished he hadn't been told, and was now professionally obligated to act on it. "These gentlemen are from the compliance division," Patrick said. The compliance division. He said it with the careful neutrality of a man reading from a script he hadn't written. The two men introduced themselves with names Damon didn't absorb. One of them had a folder. "We've completed a preliminary review," the man with the folder said, "in response to a formal inquiry submitted last night by—" He checked the page. "Castellan Holdings, registered in Luxembourg." Damon's hands were flat on the table. He kept them flat. "What kind of inquiry?" "A claim of beneficial ownership in certain financial instruments associated with 3 of your development entities. The claim was submitted with documentation." He turned the folder and slid it across the table. Damon looked at it. He didn't touch it. "What does that mean for my accounts?" he said. The man glanced at Patrick, which told Damon everything. "Pending verification of the claim, we're required to place a temporary restriction on the accounts named in the filing. A restriction. A hold. On transactions above a threshold level. While the documentation is—" "Which accounts?" Damon said. The man told him. He sat in the conference room for another 40 minutes, but he stopped hearing most of it after the man named the accounts. Because the accounts named were not peripheral accounts, not ancillary holdings. They were the operational spine of everything he ran. They were payroll, vendor payments, the reserve fund that kept 6 ongoing projects alive. With those accounts restricted, he had until the end of the month before contractors stopped showing up to work. He had perhaps 2 weeks before the project managers started making calls. He drove home. He didn't go to the office. He sat in the car in the driveway for a while, looking at the front of the house, the Italian marble, and the imported chandelier visible through the tall windows. And he thought, with a clarity he hadn't felt in years, that he did not actually know what any of this had cost. Not the building costs. He knew those. He meant the other costs. The ones you paid to people who didn't send invoices and didn't write things down and sometimes came back years later and collected. He went inside and called Cassius. The number rang 12 times and went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He sent a text that said, "Need to talk. Today. It's urgent." The message showed delivered. Then, while he was watching the screen, the delivery receipt disappeared. The contact entry changed. The number was no longer in service. He sat down on the couch in the living room with his phone in his hand and thought about what it meant when a man whose entire professional existence was built on being reachable had, in the span of an overnight news cycle, become unreachable. It meant Cassius had been warned. It meant someone had told him before Damon even knew there was something to be warned about. His phone buzzed. A number he didn't recognize, local area code. He answered. "Mr. Voss?" A woman's voice, flat and professional. My name is Ida Marsh. I'm calling on behalf of Castellan Holdings to notify you that as of 9 this morning, we've filed a formal claim of ownership reversion on 3 development assets. You should have received documents by courier. I haven't received anything, he said. You will. In the meantime, I want to make clear that this is a civil process. Our intention is to proceed through proper legal channels, and we have no interest in who told you to call me, Damon said. A pause. I represent Castellan Holdings, Mr. Voss. Castellan Holdings is a name on a document. Who's running it? Another pause, slightly longer. I'm not authorized to discuss the principles. You'll find the relevant information in the filing. Have a good morning. She ended the call. He sat with the phone in his lap. He heard Petra come down the stairs, heard her stop on the landing when she saw his face, heard the small sound she made before deciding, wisely, not to say anything immediately. I need you to leave for a few days, he said. What? Just a few days. Go to your place. I'll explain later. Damon, what's happening? Petra. He looked at her. Please go. She read something in his face that settled the argument faster than anything he could have said. She went back upstairs. He heard drawers opening and closing. He heard the particular sound of a woman packing quickly, without asking clarifying questions, which told him she understood more than she'd let on. 20 minutes later, she was gone. He didn't watch her leave. He called Marcus Hale and they talked for 90 minutes, Hale's voice cycling through the phases of a man receiving bad news in installments. Initial steadiness, then recalibration, then the careful modulated honesty of a lawyer who can see the water rising and is trying to decide which furniture can be saved. The conclusion they reached, after 90 minutes of legal geography, was that the claim had teeth. The documentation Castellan had submitted was precise and comprehensive in a way that suggested years of preparation. It described the capital flows with a specificity that would have required either inside access to the original investment records or the records themselves. Someone gave them those records, Hale said. I know, Damon said. Someone who had access to the original transaction documentation. I know. That's a short list, Damon. I know, he said. It's a list of 1. Cassius had been the only intermediary. Cassius had handled every document, every signature, every structured transfer between Castellan, or whatever the entity had been called then, and Damon's development companies. Cassius knew where every number lived, and Cassius had turned off his phone the moment the articles went live. He hadn't run. He'd been pulled. There was a difference, and the difference mattered, because a man who ran was a man acting on fear, and a man who was pulled was a man acting on instruction, and instruction meant someone had known this was coming, had prepared for it, had positioned their assets, their information, their witnesses, their documents, weeks or months in advance. He thought about Serena at the kitchen table, signing the divorce papers. He thought about how fast she'd signed. He thought about the 11 minutes it had taken her to pack. She'd known. Not just that the helicopter was coming. She had known the sequence. She had signed those papers knowing that the moment she walked out of that house with her gray suitcase, a mechanism would begin moving that she had left exactly enough time for. She hadn't fled. She had stepped aside. I was still sitting on the couch when the courier arrived with the formal filing from Castellan Holdings. He signed for it without reading the delivery receipt. He took the envelope inside and sat back down and opened it, and spent an hour going through it page by page. And when he was done, he understood with the comprehensive finality of a man reading his own medical results that the first hotel had never been his. The Carmel property had never been his. The financial district development, the one whose story he had told 100 times, the founding myth of Damon Voss, had been funded by DeMarco money routed through 3 shells and an intermediary, and every structure built on top of it had the same foundation. Everything he called his had been built on borrowed ground. He picked up the phone and called a number he hadn't called in 6 years. The number for a man named Aldrich Vane, who operated in the specific professional space between business intelligence and things you paid for without receipts. Vane answered on the 4th ring and said nothing, just waited, which was his habit. I need to find someone, Damon said. Fast, and I need information on a family. Which family? Vane said. DeMarco. The silence on the other end of the line was the kind that had texture. Then, that's expensive. Name a number. Vane named a number. Damon said yes. I'll be in touch, Vane said, and disconnected. Damon set the phone down. He looked at the oil painting in the entryway. The coastline he'd never been to, framed and lit and impressive in the way things were impressive when you purchased impressiveness by the square foot. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked up the phone again and called his press contact at the city's largest daily paper and said, in his most controlled voice, that he had a story about a family that used financial manipulation to destroy legitimate businessmen, about coercion and hidden influence and a decades-long pattern of using shell corporations to acquire leverage over people who'd never agreed to be leveraged. The press contact listened. "Can you document any of this?" she asked. "I'm working on it," Damon said. Come back to me when you can document it." She hung up. He sat in the living room of his house, the house that he now understood might also have complications in its ownership history that he'd never looked closely at. And he felt the specific cold of a man who has spent years building a fortress and has just learned the ground beneath it was never his to build on. Outside, the morning had gone to afternoon. The light through the windows had shifted. Somewhere out in the city, in whatever building or house she'd been taken to, Serena Vale was having a different kind of afternoon, and she was not thinking about him, and that fact, more than the bank accounts, more than the documents, more than the number Vane had named, was the thing that stayed with him as the light continued to move across the floor of the room he was no longer sure he owned. His phone buzzed again. A text from a number he'd never seen, no name, no context. It said, "The Carmel property deed has been filed for ownership review as of 4 p.m. today. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises before the locks are changed under legal authority of the recovery order." He stared at the message. Then he got up, went to his home office, sat at the desk, and opened the bottom drawer where he kept the things he didn't digitize. The paper records, the handwritten notes, the physical artifacts of transactions that had never been meant to leave a trail. He went through them with his hands moving fast, pulling folders, reading, discarding, reading again. He found the original agreement from 12 years ago, the one he'd signed with Cassius standing across from him in a hotel conference room, both of them in good suits, both of them acting like men who'd done this before. He read through the agreement, all 11 pages of it, and reached the final page and found the clause he'd known was there. He'd always known it was there, in the way you could know the name of something that frightened you without looking at it directly. The clause that said the original investor retained a right of reversion in the event that the funded entity was found to have caused material harm to any member of the beneficial ownership group. Material harm. He put the document down on the desk. He thought about the morning, about the kitchen and the papers and the pen and the $200,000 he had put a line through Serena Vale's 5 years with, without looking up. Material harm. He understood now why she hadn't asked for anything. She hadn't needed to ask. Every dollar she might have requested in that kitchen had already been accounted for. Not by sentiment, not by legal strategy, but by a clause buried in a 12-year-old document that he had signed with full legal competence and then spent a decade successfully not thinking about. She hadn't left empty-handed. She'd left holding everything. I was still sitting at the desk when Vane called back 3 hours earlier than expected, which was never a good sign. "I pulled what I could on the family," Vane said. His voice had something in it that hadn't been there during the first call, something tightly wound and careful. "There's a lot of it, and most of it is old, but I found something recent, something you should know before you take another step in any direction." "Tell me," Damon said. "The woman," Vane said, "your wife." "Ex-wife." "Whatever she is. She's not just Lucian DeMarco's ward or his protege or whatever the story is. She's his daughter, biological daughter. Her mother was DeMarco's first wife, died when the girl was 4. She was raised inside the organization until she was 22, at which point there was an incident, an internal security breach, a faction within the family that tried to remove her from the succession line by force." Damon's grip on the phone tightened. "They nearly succeeded," Vane said. "She survived, but it was close. According to what I could find, she left voluntarily afterward. Changed her name. Dropped off the map. Lucien let her go. The word I got is that he respected her choice, or at least accepted it, and the understanding was that as long as she was safe and left alone, the family would stay back." The room was very quiet. "She wasn't just his daughter," Vane said. "She was his heir. She was supposed to run the organization. When she disappeared, Lucian kept things going but never formally named a successor. It's been open for 9 years. There are people inside the structure who've been maneuvering for that position for years, and they've been counting on her staying gone. And then I humiliated her, Damon said. Publicly, Vane said. Repeatedly, from what I understand, there are recordings. What recordings? Audio, from inside your house. The article that went out last night included 2 of them as embedded files. I'm surprised you didn't. Vane paused. Have you not looked at the full article? He hadn't. He'd read the financial sections and stopped. Look at the full article, Vane said. He pulled it up on his laptop while Vane was still on the line. He scrolled past the financial documentation, past the Shell Corporation diagrams, and found the embedded audio files near the bottom. 2 of them, each less than 3 minutes long, each labeled with a date and the words Voss Residence, Interior Recording. He pressed play on the first one and heard his own voice, clear, unhurried, contemptuous, telling Serena that she dressed like someone's housekeeper and that he wasn't sure why he'd ever thought a woman with no family and no ambition and no discernible personality would make an adequate wife for a man in his position. He remembered the conversation. He remembered the morning it had happened. He didn't remember feeling bad about it. He pressed play on the second one and heard himself at a dinner party responding to a guest's question about Serena's absence by saying that she was probably at home reorganizing something, which was all she was really suited for, and that some people were background figures and some people were principals, and you couldn't make one into the other no matter how much money you spent on them. Laughter in the background, his own included. He closed the laptop. Vane was still on the phone. Those went everywhere, Vane said. Social media, news aggregators. As of an hour ago, the second clip has 2.4 million views. Damon said nothing. There are more, Vane said. I don't know how many more, but the pattern I'm seeing is staged. This isn't a leak. This is a release schedule. Whoever is managing this is giving each piece room to breathe, letting the public reaction build between drops. She's not doing this, Damon said. No, Vane agreed. She's not the type. But she doesn't have to be. She just had to leave, and the machinery did the rest. He sat at the desk with his dead laptop and his paper documents and the reversion clause and the recordings of his own voice doing what he'd spent 5 years practicing, the casual, fluent degradation of a woman who had, it turned out, been listening the entire time. Not to use against him, not in the beginning. She hadn't placed the recordings. She hadn't set the mechanism in motion. She had simply lived in the house, and someone who loved her had watched and waited and kept records. And when the day came that Damon Voss signed his name on a line that said 200,000 and looked back at his phone, someone pressed a button. What do you want me to do? Vane said. Damon looked at the reversion clause. He looked at the text about the Carmel property. He looked at the list of restricted accounts written in his own handwriting on the pad beside the keyboard. Find Cassius, he said. Vane found Cassius in 4 days. That was faster than Damon had expected, and the speed of it should have been a warning, the way fast answers in complex situations were usually answers that someone wanted you to have. But he was not in a position to be careful. I was in a position where his operational accounts were frozen. 2 of his project managers had submitted formal notices of work stoppage, and a reporter from a national outlet had left 3 voicemails requesting comment on what she described as a pattern of financial misrepresentation spanning a decade. He was in a position where his options had narrowed to the point where fast felt like good, and he didn't examine the distinction. Vane sent an address, a motel off a state highway 2 hours east of the city, the kind of place that still used physical keys and didn't ask questions, and had a parking lot full of cars that were parked at angles, suggesting the drivers had arrived in a hurry. Damon drove himself again. He wore no suit this time, dark pants, a jacket, the deliberate anonymity of a man who had spent years being conspicuous and was learning, too late, the value of not being seen. He found the room number Vane had given him and knocked. Cassius opened the door with the chain still on and looked at Damon through the gap with the expression of a man who had expected this moment and had decided how to play it some time ago. He was heavier than Damon remembered. His hair had gone fully gray. He was wearing a collared shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and he was holding a glass of something amber, and his eyes were the particular eyes of a man who had run out of the energy required for pretending. "You should not be here," Cassius said. "Open the door." "Damon, open the door, Cassius." The chain came off. Damon went in. The room smelled like stale air and old carpet, and the faint chemical sweetness of whatever Cassius was drinking, and the curtains were drawn, and the television was on with the sound muted, cycling through news footage. Damon caught a glimpse of his own building, the financial district development, the one in the founding myth, in a graphic accompanying a news segment. He looked away from it. Cassius sat on the end of the bed. He didn't offer Damon a seat. Damon stood. "The documents," Damon said. "You gave them the documents." Cassius looked at his glass. "I didn't give anyone anything." "Then explain to me how Castellan Holdings filed a claim with transaction-level detail that only you and I had access to." "I kept records," Cassius said. "I always kept records. That was the arrangement. The records stayed with me as collateral. That was the deal, Damon. You knew that." "The deal was that those records stayed private. The deal was that those records stayed private as long as certain conditions held." He looked up. "The conditions changed." Damon felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. "What conditions?" Cassius set the glass down on the nightstand. He laced his fingers together in his lap and looked at Damon with the tired patience of a man explaining something to someone who already knows the answer. "The girl," he said. "When you married her, I had concerns. I told you. Do you remember? 12 years ago I sat across from you and I said, 'There are people whose names you don't put near your own name without permission.' You remember that conversation? I remember you being vague about something I asked you to be specific about. I was as specific as I was allowed to be." He picked the glass up again. "She was under Lucien DeMarco's protection. She had been for her entire life. When she chose to disappear, Lucien gave specific instructions that she was to be left alone, and that extended to anyone in her proximity. As long as she lived quietly and was not harmed or humiliated in any documentable way, the arrangement stood. You were a peripheral beneficiary of that protection, whether you knew it or not." "And the recordings?" Cassius shrugged, which was a gesture Damon found intolerable. "When did those start?" Damon said. "I don't know when they started." "When did you know they existed?" A pause. "I knew when she came to see me." The room went very still. "When?" Damon said. 3 years ago." Cassius met his eyes. "She came to me 3 years ago. She'd found a reference to my name in a document you had left on the kitchen counter. A draft of something, I don't know what. She traced it. She's thorough, Damon. She has always been thorough. She sat across from me in a coffee shop for 2 hours, and she didn't threaten me, and she didn't plead with me. She asked me questions, and she listened to the answers, and she told me she wasn't going to act on any of it for as long as she could avoid it." Damon's voice came out quieter than he intended. "You talked to her?" "I talked to her." "For 2 hours?" "Yes." "And you didn't tell me." Cassius looked at him with something in his face that was not quite pity and not quite contempt, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "What would I have told you, Damon? That the woman you were treating like a piece of furniture had figured out the entire financial architecture of everything you built and had a legal mechanism to dismantle it and had decided not to use it? You would have—" He stopped. He shook his head. "You would have tried to force her hand before she was ready, and then it would have been worse, faster and worse. You were protecting her." "I was protecting myself," Cassius said flatly. "I knew whose daughter she was by then. I'd done my own research. I had no interest in being the man who helped Damon Voss corner Lucien DeMarco's daughter." Damon pulled a chair from the small desk in the corner and sat down. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely joined, and he looked at the muted television where his building rotated in a news graphic, and he breathed. "The divorce," he said. "She knew what signing those papers would trigger." "Yes." "She waited until the settlement was signed and executed before triggering the reversion clause. The settlement itself, the $200,000, was the trigger condition. Under the original agreement, any cash settlement offered to a member of the beneficial ownership group in lieu of rightful share constituted an acknowledgement of the capital relationship. When she accepted that amount, she documented that she was being offered $200,000 in exchange for her interest in assets worth." Cassius tilted his head slightly. "Considerably more." Damon looked at him. "How much more?" he said. Cassius told him. Damon sat in the chair for a long time after that without speaking. The number Cassius had named was not a number he had been prepared for, and he was not sure there was a preparation that would have been adequate. It was a number that made the $200,000 look like something you'd find in a coat pocket. It was a number that reframed 12 years of what he'd believed was self-made success into something else entirely. A tenure, a managed period of productivity. A man who had been allowed to build and to profit and to tell himself a story, right up until the moment the people who had financed the story decided the arrangement was over. "Why are you telling me all this?" Damon said. "Because you drove 2 hours to ask me." "That's not a reason, Cassius." The older man looked at his glass. "Because I'm tired," he said. "I have been doing this for 30 years, and I am tired. And you were never a bad man, Damon. Arrogant, careless, a man who mistook convenience for virtue. But not bad, and I think you deserve to know the full shape of the thing you're standing inside." "The full shape," Damon repeated. "There's more," Cassius said. "The Castellan filing and the account restrictions. That's the surface layer. The legal mechanism. That will take months to fully resolve, and you'll lose most of it, but it will be a process with steps and timelines and hearings, and your attorney will be present for all of it." He paused. "What I'm more concerned about is the other thing." Damon raised his head. "What other thing?" Cassius set the glass down for the last time and folded his hands in his lap. "When Serena left the organization 9 years ago, she left because a faction inside the DeMarco structure tried to have her killed. Not removed, killed. The reason was succession. There are people inside that family who have been operating without a named heir for 9 years, and who have built significant power in that vacuum. Her return changes the calculus. It collapses 9 years of positioning." He looked at Damon steadily. "Those people are not happy, and they have been watching the news this week the same way everyone else has." The air in the room was close and stale. Damon could hear traffic from the highway distantly. "What does that have to do with me?" he said. "Because those people," Cassius said slowly, "have reached out to a mutual contact in the past 48 hours, looking for a way to access Serena's current location, looking for a lever." He paused. "And your name came up." Damon stood up from the chair. I know you're not working with them. I'm telling you that they are interested in working with you. Whether you agree to it or not, your name is in a conversation that will have consequences, because you are the last person who had daily access to Serena Vale, and you are the person who is most publicly and documentably hostile to her right now, and that makes you useful to people who want to hurt her. The gravity of it settled over Damon like something with weight. "Who are they?" he said. Cassius shook his head. "I've told you enough." "Cassius?" "I've told you enough, Damon. What you do with it is yours." He picked up the glass again, looked at it, set it back down. "My strong advice is that you find your attorney and you focus on the civil filings, and you do not return any calls from numbers you don't recognize, and you stay very far away from anything that isn't a courtroom or a conference room." Damon drove back to the city in the dark. He drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, the highway unspooling ahead of him in his headlights, and he tried to think sequentially. Step 1, Step 2, the way he'd always organized problems, converting chaos into logistics, because logistics was something you could manage. But the steps wouldn't sequence. Every time he tried to build an ordered list of actions, the list dissolved into the face Lucien DeMarco had shown him across the lawn, brief and damaging and utterly without urgency, the face of a man for whom Damon Voss was an item to be dealt with, rather than a person to be reckoned with. He got home at 11. He checked his phone on the front step before going inside, a habit he'd developed in the last 4 days, the constant monitoring of a man waiting for the next piece of bad news to arrive. 3 missed calls from Marcus Hale. A text from his project manager on the harbor development, subject line, "Crew walking off tomorrow." A voicemail from a number he didn't recognize. He went inside. He called Hale first. Hale's voice was the voice of a man who had been sitting at his desk waiting for this call and had used the wait time to rehearse his delivery. "There's been a development in the Castellan filing," he said. "They submitted supplemental documentation this afternoon." "What kind of supplemental?" "A purchase agreement, dated 11 years ago, between Castellan Holdings and your development company, the original entity, before you restructured in the second year." "I know the entity." "The agreement specifies that in the event of dissolution, sale, or court-ordered asset recovery, Castellan retains first position claim on all derivative assets, not just the 3 original projects, Damon. The derivative assets, the Harlow deal, the waterfront parcels, the hotel group." Damon sat down on the stairs. He sat on the third step up from the bottom, in his dark jacket, and looked at the entryway table where Serena had left the credit cards fanned out like a folded hand. "That agreement is 11 years old," he said. "How does it only surface now?" It was filed as a sealed document with a law firm in Luxembourg. The seal lapsed automatically upon filing of the primary claim. "It was always there, Damon. It was designed to surface at this exact moment." "She knew," he said. "Someone knew, for a long time." He ended the call. He sat on the stair. He listened to the house around him. The refrigerator's hum, the tick of something cooling in the walls, the specific silence of a large, expensive house at night, where no one else was breathing. He thought about 11 years. He thought about the purchase agreement sitting in a sealed file in Luxembourg while he built and leveraged and expanded and told his story in magazines and at panels. While he signed the papers and poured the coffee he didn't clean up and told Serena she dressed like a housekeeper, while he booked the dinner reservation at Sorrel, while he wrote 200,000 on a line and pushed it across the table without looking up. 11 years of a file sitting in Luxembourg waiting for him to do exactly what he had done. He picked up his phone and listened to the voicemail from the unknown number. The voice on it was male, calm, with an accent that suggested several places without committing to any of them. "Mr. Voss, you don't know me. I know a great deal about you, and more importantly, I know a great deal about what you are currently facing. I believe we have a common interest. Not in revenge. I understand that's not your nature. In resolution. A way through this that preserves something of what you've built and removes the leverage currently being used against you. I'd like to meet. Someplace public, your choice, tomorrow or the day after. Please call this number back within 24 hours if you're interested in having that conversation." Damon listened to it twice. Then he listened to it a third time, with Cassius's voice running underneath it. "Your name came up. They are interested in working with you." He didn't call back. He went to bed at midnight and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house and did not sleep. At 6 in the morning, his phone rang. The number was local. He answered it because at that hour, after 4 days of this, he was answering everything. It was a woman's voice, not the Castellan attorney, someone else, younger, faster, with the clipped speech of someone making a call they'd made before and didn't intend to spend much time on. "Mr. Voss, my name doesn't matter. I'm calling to tell you that your friend Petra Solis has not arrived at her apartment." A pause. "She left your house 3 days ago. She has not been home since. Her phone goes to voicemail. Her neighbor's been picking up her mail." Damon sat up. "Who is this?" "Someone who thought you should know before you heard it another way." "Where is she?" "That's what I'm telling you, Mr. Voss. We don't know. But we thought you should understand that her disappearance follows a pattern. There was a woman connected to a business associate of yours, a project manager, I believe, who went missing briefly 2 years ago when her husband got into a dispute with a certain family. She came back. She was fine. But the message was received. This is a threat," he said. "This is information. You're telling me someone took Petra to send me a message. I'm telling you that Petra Solis has not been seen in 3 days, and that you are currently in a conflict with people who have historically used personal relationships as pressure points. Whether those two facts are connected is something you'd need to determine yourself." The call ended. He was out of bed with his feet on the floor and his mind assembling a new and terrible architecture before the phone had fully lowered from his ear. Because there were 2 possibilities and only 2. Either someone connected to the DeMarco family had taken Petra to increase pressure on him, which made a kind of brutal sense, but which did not fit what he'd seen of Lucien DeMarco's operational style. The man who had stepped off a helicopter on his lawn and said, "We won't need anything from you," with the calm of someone who had already won. Or someone else had taken her. Someone who wanted Damon to believe the DeMarcos had taken her. Someone who wanted him frightened and angry and pointed in a specific direction. The unknown number, the voicemail, a way through this that preserves something of what you've built. He called Vane. Vane answered on the second ring. Damon told him about the call, told him about Petra, told him about the voicemail from the unknown number and what Cassius had said about factions inside the DeMarco structure looking for a lever. Vane was quiet through all of it. When Damon finished, Vane said, "The voicemail. Can you send me the number?" Damon sent it. 40 seconds later, Vane said, "That number is registered to a shell entity operating out of the same network I've been mapping since you first called me. These are not DeMarco people. These are the people inside the organization who want to destabilize the DeMarco succession. They're using your situation as a weapon. They've possibly taken your associate to force your hand. Force my hand how? To make you do something publicly hostile to Serena Vale or her father. Something that gives them cover. Something that makes it look like outside forces are threatening the family so they can position themselves as the protective response. Damon looked at the bedroom wall. The light was coming up outside. They want me to attack her, he said. They want you to appear to attack her. The distinction matters to them more than it matters to you. And Petra, if they have her, she's alive. She's a tool, not a target. But if you call that number back and agree to meet those people, you become complicit in something that will make Castellan Holdings look like a parking ticket. Damon's hand was very tight around the phone. How do I find out if they have her? He said. You don't, Vane said. Not safely, not fast. This is the play, Damon. They've put you in a position where every move available to you benefits them. You call back, you meet them, you're their instrument. You go to DeMarco directly, you're begging the man who's already dismantling your life. You go to the police, you open an investigation that will go straight through your accounts before it reaches anyone else. You do nothing, Petra stays missing, and the pressure builds until you break. Outside, a bird was making a sound in the tree by the bedroom window. Damon noticed it with the fractured attention of a man whose mind was running too fast to fully land anywhere. There's a fourth option, Vane said, quieter now. You go to her. To Serena. She's the only person in this situation who has both the information and the standing to address this in a way that doesn't destroy you further. She knows these people. She grew up with them. She knows how they operate. And she has reason, if you approach it correctly, to understand that what's happening to you right now is also happening around her. Those people took your associate to create a situation. Creating a situation around Serena is their actual goal. Damon was quiet for a long time. She won't see me, he said. You don't know that. After what He stopped. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eye socket. Vane, you've heard the recordings. I've heard them. Then you know she has no reason to see me. No, Vane said. But she might have reason to hear what you know. Those are different things. He sat on the edge of the bed in the gray early light and thought about Cassius saying she's thorough. Damon, she has always been thorough. And thought about 3 years ago when she'd sat across from Cassius in a coffee shop and asked quiet questions and listened without flinching. And he thought about the way she'd signed the papers. Not with relief, not with anger, with a kind of sealed finality that he now understood was the finality of someone closing a door on something they had already fully processed. She had processed him. She had processed all of it, 3 years ago or more, and she had made her peace with it, and she had waited, and she had left cleanly. And now someone else was using the debris of his marriage as a weapon aimed at her family, and Petra was somewhere not answering her phone, and the unknown number was waiting for a callback that would transform Damon Voss from a man being ruined into a man who had chosen his ruin willingly and with full knowledge of what he was doing. He thought about all of this, and then he did the thing that 3 weeks ago would have been physically impossible for him to imagine himself doing. He called Marcus Hale and got Serena's contact information from the DeMarco attorney who had reached out to Hale 2 days prior about the Castellan filing, who had left a number and said they were available if Mr. Voss wished to discuss a resolution framework. Hale gave him the number with the particular silence of a lawyer who has stopped giving advice because his client has moved past the point where advice has traction. Damon looked at the number for a long time. Then he dialed it, and it rang twice, and a man answered. Not Lucian, someone younger, efficient. And Damon said he needed to speak with Serena Vale, and the man said, "Hold on," and there was a pause. And then her voice came on the line, even and unhurried, the voice of a woman who had been expecting this call without knowing exactly when it would arrive. "Damon," she said. He opened his mouth and found, for the first time in a long time, that he did not have a prepared version of what he needed to say. "Someone took Petra," he said, "and I don't think it was your father." A silence on the line. Not the silence of surprise. The silence of a woman rapidly reordering information she already had. "Where are you?" she said. "At the house," he said. Another pause. He could hear something in the background on her end. Voices, low and indistinct, the ambient sound of a large space with people moving through it. Then the voices stopped, as though a door had closed. "Stay there," she said. Don't call that number back. Don't open the door for anyone you don't know by name. Can you do that? Yes? Someone will be there in 40 minutes. The call ended. He sat on the bed with the phone in his lap and felt, in the silence that followed, something he hadn't felt in the entirety of this week. Not relief exactly, but the specific sensation of a man who has been falling and has found something solid to stop against, even if the stop was bruising. He went downstairs. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window and watched the morning come up over the back lawn, the same lawn where the helicopter had landed 5 days ago, the grass still bearing faint impressions where the landing gear had compressed it. He looked at those impressions and thought about how the landscape of a place changed without your permission. You could own a piece of ground and still wake up one morning to find it marked by forces you hadn't invited and couldn't erase. The 40 minutes passed slowly. The knock when it came was 3 quiet raps, unhurried. He went to the door and looked through the glass panel beside it and saw a man he didn't recognize. 30s, dark jacket, hands visible, the particular stillness of someone trained to present as unthreatening. Damon opened the door. "Miss Boss," the man said. "My name is Theo. I work with Ms. Vale's security team. She asked me to bring you to her." "She's coming here?" "No, sir. She'd like you to come to her." He almost said something about that, about the particular inversion of it, being collected from his own house and brought to a woman he had dismissed from it less than a week ago. He didn't say it. He got his jacket and his phone and he went. The drive took 25 minutes. Theo drove without speaking and Damon did not ask where they were going. He watched the city move past the window, the financial district, his building visible for a moment between 2 others, still standing, still carrying his name on the facade, even as the legal ground beneath it eroded. And then they were in a quieter part of the city, older buildings, less glass, the kind of neighborhood that had been something else before money found it and was still in the process of being converted. They stopped in front of a building that looked like a renovated warehouse. Nothing on the exterior identified it. There were 2 men at the entrance who nodded at Theo and held the door. Inside, the building had been rebuilt completely. Clean lines, good light, the controlled temperature of a space where serious things happened. A woman at a desk looked up when Damon entered and then looked back down without speaking. Theo walked him to an elevator, pressed a floor, and when the doors opened, walked him down a hallway and stopped at a door and knocked once. "Come in," Serena said. The room was a conference room, large windows on one side, a long table, 6 chairs. Serena was at the far end of the table with a laptop open and 2 people on either side of her, a woman with close-cropped hair and the focused stillness of someone who was always reading the room, and a man in his 50s with the build of someone who had once been physically formidable and was still formidable in a different way. Neither of them introduced themselves. Serena looked at Damon. She looked at him the way she had rarely looked at him in 5 years of marriage, directly, without the small social adjustments that people made when they were managing someone else's ego. She looked at him the way you looked at a problem you were in the process of solving. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "Tell me about the phone call. The woman who told you about Petra." He told her. She listened without moving, without interrupting, with the quality of attention he now recognized from Cassius's description, thorough. When he finished, she looked at the woman to her left, and something passed between them that wasn't a word. "The number Vane identified," she said. "The shell entity." "Did he give you a name for the network?" "He said it was connected to people inside your family's organization, people positioning for succession." She looked at the table for a moment, not with surprise, with the look of someone confirming a thing they had hoped would remain theoretical. "There are 3 names," she said, "that have been discussed in that context. One of them I've known about since before I left. One of them I identified during the last 9 years through monitoring. The third one I learned this morning." She paused. "The third one is the one who concerns me." "Why?" Damon said. She looked at him. "Because the third one is someone who was present the day I left. Someone who was supposed to be loyal to my father and who, according to what we've pieced together since I came back, has been running a parallel operation inside the structure for at least 6 years. And someone in that position, with 6 years of internal access." She stopped. "They don't need to improvise. They have infrastructure. They have contingencies. Like taking Petra." "Like taking Petra," she said, "not because you matter to them directly, because you're a pressure point that generates noise. They want my father reactive. They want the situation public and volatile, because public volatility is the only environment in which they can move without being the visible cause. Damon's hands were flat on the table. Can you get her back? Serena looked at him for a long moment. It was a look that had several things in it. Not warmth, but not cruelty either. Something more honest than either. The look of a person deciding how much of the truth was constructive and how much was merely accurate. We're working on locating her, she said. We have people on it, but I need to understand something from you first, and I need you to answer it without the version you'd normally give. He said nothing, which was itself an answer. The voicemail, she said. The offer of a way through this. Part of you considered calling it back. It wasn't a question. Yes, he said. What stopped you? He thought about giving her several answers because several were available and most of them were at least partially true. He'd listened to Vane, he'd run the logic, he'd understood the trap, but underneath all of that, at the bottom of it, was something simpler and less flattering. I heard the recording, he said, the second one, at the dinner party. He looked at the table. I don't remember feeling bad about it when I said it. I remember it being easy. The way some things are easy when you've decided someone doesn't fully count. He looked up. I heard myself say it, and I heard the laughter, including mine, and I thought, whoever took Petra is using me because I made it easy to use me. I made myself into exactly the kind of person they could aim. The room was quiet. The woman to Serena's left had the carefully neutral expression of someone who was hearing something they hadn't expected and was not going to show it. Serena looked at Damon for a moment. Then she looked at the man to her right and said, "Give us a few minutes." Both of them stood without comment and left the room and closed the door. She looked at him. "I don't forgive you," she said. "I want to be clear about that because I think in your current situation, you may be inclined to interpret any kindness as something it isn't." "I'm not looking for forgiveness," he said. "I'm looking for Petra." "I know, but you should also know that the reason I took your call this morning and the reason you're in this room is not because of what you said just now. It's because these people, the faction, the third name, they have been trying to force me back into a position of vulnerability since I returned. Every move they've made this week has been designed to either isolate me from my father's support or provoke a public confrontation that damages the organization." She paused. "You are, despite everything, a witness. You have documentation they don't know about. You have a connection to Cassius that I didn't know still existed, and you're currently in a position where they believe they can turn you. Which means you're also, if handled correctly, a variable they haven't fully accounted for." He looked at her. "You want to use me?" "I want to resolve this," she said. "Those aren't the same thing, but they're not entirely different either. And yes, part of resolving this involves you." She turned the laptop toward him. On the screen was a photograph. A man, mid-50s, silver-haired, with the kind of face that read as distinguished from a distance. Damon recognized him with a small, cold shock, the way you recognize someone from a context you'd never thought to connect. "You know him," she said. It wasn't a question. "He was at my hotel opening," Damon said, 3 years ago. "He was introduced to me as a hospitality consultant. He came with a referral from—" He stopped. "From Cassius," Serena said. "Yes." "His name is Renard Cole," she said. "He has been inside my father's organization for 11 years. He was present the night of the attempt on my life. He was one of the people who helped me get out afterward, which is why it took us this long to identify him." She closed the laptop. "He is the one who has Petra, and he is the one who left you that voicemail." Damon looked at the closed laptop, at the blankness of the screen. He thought about the hospitality consultant at his hotel opening, the handshake, the easy conversation about market trends, the introduction via Cassius that he had received without scrutiny the way he received most things, as his due, as the natural consequence of being the kind of man who attracted useful connections. Renard Cole had been in his hotel, in his building. Built, at least in part, on DeMarco money that Cole had known about for 11 years. The geometry of it was almost elegant if you stood far enough back from it to not feel what it actually was, which was a decade of his life having been visible to people he hadn't known were watching, used as a piece in a game he hadn't known he was in. "What do you need from me?" he said. Serena looked at him steadily. "When he calls again, And he will call again within the next 12 hours because the window he's working in is closing. You're going to answer, and you're going to say yes. Cole called at 9:47 that night. Damon was sitting in the kitchen of his house with a glass of water he hadn't touched, his phone face up on the table, and Serena's instructions running through his head in the flat, even cadence she'd used to deliver them, the cadence of someone who had done operational planning before and understood that clarity was more useful than comfort. Answer. Agree to meet. Ask for proof that Petra is alive before confirming the location. Do not negotiate. Do not threaten. Sound like a man who has made a decision he's slightly ashamed of, because that is a man Renard Cole will believe. The phone buzzed. Unknown number. Same area code as the voicemail. Damon picked it up on the third ring. Not the first, because the first was too eager, and not the fourth, because the fourth was resistance, and resistance was not what tonight required. Mr. Voss, Cole said. The accent again, that placeless quality, each word landing with precision. I'm glad you're still available. I almost wasn't, Damon said, but you are. I need to know she's all right first. A pause. Brief. Controlled. The pause of a man who had expected this and had prepared for it without being inconvenienced by it. Of course. A rustling sound. Then Petra's voice, strained, clipped, the voice of someone speaking under instruction but alive, demonstrably alive, with the slightly elevated pitch of a woman working very hard to hold herself together. Damon, I'm okay. They haven't hurt me. Please do what they... Cole's voice returned. Satisfied? Damon's hand was rigid around the phone. He made himself breathe, made himself produce the voice of a man calculating rather than a man fighting back the physical urge to put his fist through something. Where? He said. Waterfront, the old Callaway shipyard on the South Docks. You know it? He didn't. He said he did. Come alone. Midnight. If we see anyone else in the vicinity, the conversation ends and so do the arrangements for your friend. Another pause. Come prepared to be useful, Mr. Voss. That's all I'm asking. The call ended. Damon set the phone down. His hand was shaking slightly. Not from fear exactly, but from the effort of suppressing every instinct that the call had activated. He sat with it for 10 seconds. Then he picked the phone up and sent the text Serena had told him to send. Single letter C, followed by the address. The response came back in under a minute. 3 words. We're already there. He drove to the shipyard. He drove alone, the way Cole had specified, because the instruction was to present himself as the thing Cole believed he was, a cornered man making a bad decision with his eyes open. The docks at this hour were the docks at their most honest. Dark water, salt in the air, the industrial skeleton of warehouses and cranes that had outlasted their original purpose and were waiting to be told what they were for now. His headlights swept across chain link and corrugated metal and a gate that was open when it should have been locked. He parked and got out and stood in the cold, salt air for a moment. His chest was doing something he didn't have a clinical name for. Not quite pain, not quite pressure. The body's way of registering a situation it hadn't been designed to navigate. He walked through the gate. The shipyard interior was vast and poorly lit. Overhead lights in 2 of the 4 corners casting orange pools across stacked equipment and the hulks of 2 dry-docked vessels in various states of deconstruction. Damon walked toward the light. His footsteps on the concrete were louder than he wanted them to be. Mr. Voss! Cole stepped out from behind a metal staircase to his left. He looked exactly like the photograph. Silver-haired, composed, dressed in dark clothing that was expensive in its understatement. He had 2 men with him. Both of them were standing in positions that were professionally chosen, flanking at angles, and both of them had the particular relaxed readiness of men for whom physical violence was a job skill rather than an emotional event. Cole extended his hand. Damon looked at it for a moment and then shook it, because shaking it was the thing a man in his position would do. A man who needed something from this meeting and was pragmatic enough to swallow his distaste. Thank you for coming, Cole said. Where's Petra? Nearby. She'll be returned to you tonight, assuming everything goes smoothly. He tilted his head slightly. Shall we talk? Talk, Damon said. Cole walked toward a folding table that had been set up under one of the overhead lights. The kind of improvised field setup that suggested this location had been prepared in advance. That Cole had stood in this shipyard before tonight and arranged these specifics with the methodical patience of a man who planned in layers. On the table was a tablet, a folder, and a sealed envelope. "What I'm about to show you," Cole said, "is a filing, a civil action, prepared on your behalf." He opened the folder and turned it toward Damon. "It alleges that the Castellan Holdings claim was made under fraudulent pretenses, specifically that the original investment agreement was executed under coercive conditions, and that Serena Vale, as an active participant in the DeMarco organization, knowingly concealed her identity and her family's financial interest during your marriage, constituting deliberate entrapment and financial deception." Damon looked at the document. "That's not what happened." "That doesn't matter," Cole said pleasantly. "What matters is that it introduces doubt into the legal proceedings. It forces disclosure. It compels Serena Vale to testify to her identity and her role in the organization, on the record, under oath, in a public forum." He paused. "Which removes the careful distance she has maintained between herself and the family's operations and places her directly in a legal spotlight at a moment when the organization is undergoing transition." Damon looked at him. "You're not trying to help me. I'm trying to help both of us. Your situation becomes more defensible. My situation becomes more navigable. This is what productive alignment looks like between people with overlapping interests. And all I have to do is sign a fraudulent filing." Cole's expression didn't change. "All you have to do is authorize your attorney to submit a document that you have genuine grievances to support. You've been financially dismantled by a process that was engineered against you. You're entitled to contest it. And Serena gets subpoenaed, her father gets exposed. The organization destabilizes, and you," Damon looked at him steadily, "you step into the vacuum." A slight pause. Then Cole smiled, and it was the first genuinely honest thing his face had done since they'd shaken hands. "You're smarter than your recent press suggests." "Sign the filing," Damon said slowly, as though working through it. "Get Petra back. Walk away with something left." "Precisely." Damon looked at the document again. He looked at it for long enough that it was plausible, the look of a man on the edge of a decision, tipping. He reached out and put his hand on the folder. Then the lights in the shipyard changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the quality of the darkness outside the building's open loading bays, a change in the ambient sound. Cole noticed it approximately 2 seconds before his men did, which told Damon something about the man's instincts. Cole's head turned toward the nearest loading bay, and in that turn Damon saw, for the first time, a crack in the composed surface. Something quick, an animal, running underneath the silver-haired deliberateness. "What did you do?" Cole said. His voice was still level, but the pleasantness had evaporated. "I answered the phone," Damon said. The first man through the loading bay was Theo, moving fast and low, and he was followed by 2 others, and they came through the space with the focused efficiency of people who had entered hostile spaces before and had stopped being afraid of it. From the upper level of the shipyard, a metal walkway that ran along the east wall, a voice called down a clear instruction that was followed immediately by Cole's 2 men ceasing to be relaxed. Cole moved. He was fast for a man his age. He turned and went for the interior of the shipyard, away from the loading bay, away from Theo's team, and Damon moved without thinking, cut left, put himself between Cole and the corridor he was heading for. Cole stopped. They were 4 feet apart. Cole looked at him with something that had moved past the composure entirely and arrived at the face underneath it. Older, tighter, the face of a man who had been running a long game and could feel it ending. "Move," Cole said. "No," Damon said. Cole's hand went to his jacket. Damon grabbed the table, the folding table, the one with the filing and the tablet and the sealed envelope, and turned it into the space between them, not as a weapon, just as mass, just as something that required Cole to deal with it, and in the 2 seconds that took, Theo was there. Theo was considerably more efficient than the folding table. Cole went down with the controlled abruptness of a man who had been trained and was now being outclassed by someone with better training, and then there were hands and cable ties, and Cole was on the concrete and the 2 flanking men were against the wall with their hands visible, and the shipyard was full of people who hadn't been there 60 seconds ago, moving with the quiet purposefulness of a rehearsed operation unfolding on schedule. Damon stood next to the overturned table with his pulse in his throat, and his hands not entirely steady, and the salt air coming through the loading bay cold against his face. Serena walked in through the loading bay. She was wearing dark clothing and her hair was pulled back, and she looked at the shipyard with the eyes of someone taking inventory. Coal on the ground, the two men against the wall, the tablet and the folder scattered across the concrete, the sealed envelope that had skidded under a piece of equipment. She walked through all of it with a steadiness that was not performance. It was just how she moved. She stopped near Cole and looked down at him. Cole looked up at her from the concrete. His composure had reassembled itself somewhat. Not fully, but enough that he was making the effort, which Damon found both impressive and nauseating. "Serena," Cole said. "This isn't Petrosolis," she said. "Where?" Cole said nothing. "Renard." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You helped me out of this organization 9 years ago. I haven't forgotten that. But I need you to understand that what you've done this week is not something I can manage quietly, and the only thing that changes what happens next is whether Petrosolis comes back healthy." Cole held her eyes for a moment. Then he said an address, a storage facility 3 miles north, unit number, lock code. Serena nodded once. She looked at Theo, and he was already on the phone. She turned and looked at the scattered tablet on the concrete. She walked to it and picked it up and looked at the screen, which had cracked but was still lit. She read what was on it with the quick lateral motion of someone scanning rather than reading. Then she set it down. "This is live," she said. She wasn't talking to Cole. She was talking to the room, to Theo, to her people, to the walls of the shipyard. "It's been broadcasting." Damon looked at her. "What do you mean live?" "The tablet. It's a relay. Whatever was said at this table in the last..." She checked the timestamp on the screen. "In the last 22 minutes has been transmitted." The implication moved through the space like a change in air pressure. Cole on the ground understood it first, and something shifted in his face. Not the composure cracking this time, but a different expression, something more complex. The expression of a man who has just realized that his own instrument has been turned. "You knew," Damon said to her. "You knew about the relay." "We suspected he'd document the meeting. Proof of your compliance was the whole point from his perspective. He needed to be able to show that you'd agreed to submit the filing." She looked at Damon. "We needed to make sure what the relay transmitted was more useful to us than to him." "The conversation. Everything I said." "Everything," she said, including Cole explaining exactly what he was trying to accomplish and why. She paused. "That transmission went to 3 federal correspondents, 2 regulatory bodies, and the head of every major allied organization in this city. Everything Cole needed you to do in secret, he just did in public." Cole made a sound on the concrete that wasn't quite a word. Damon stood in the shipyard with the cold air moving through it and tried to locate his bearings. "The filing," he said. "The fraudulent filing he wanted me to sign. Never existed," she said. "It was a prop. Something to hold your attention while the relay ran. There was no real document. He never intended to help you. The goal was footage of you agreeing to act against our family, which he could use to justify whatever action his faction took next." She looked at him. "You were going to be the provocation, Damon, the public hostile act that gave them cover." He thought about Cassius. He thought about what Cassius had said. "They want you pointed in a specific direction." "But I didn't sign anything," he said. "No," she said. "You didn't." They looked at each other across the concrete floor of the shipyard, across the overturned table and the scattered documents and the distance of everything that had happened in the last week and the 5 years before it. And it was not a warm look, and it was not a forgiving one, but it was honest. And honest was something they had not managed to be in the same room for a very long time. Theo appeared at the loading bay. "She's out," he said. "She's okay. Car's taking her to the medical team." Damon closed his eyes for 2 seconds. Just 2. Then he opened them. "What happens to him?" he said. Serena looked at Cole, still on the concrete, still managing his expression with the professional determination of a man who had not yet accepted the full weight of his situation. "Federal authorities have the transmission," she said. "They'll have questions. So will the organizations he's been running his operation under. The vacuum he was trying to create, the one he's been positioning himself for 9 years to fill, that closes now. Everyone who's been waiting on his assurances understands tonight what those assurances were worth," Cole said from the floor. "You can't contain this, Serena. There are people. I know who the people are," she said. "I've always known who the people are. I grew up in the same rooms, Renard. I ate dinner with half of them." She looked at him with something that was perhaps the closest thing to sadness she'd shown all night. You helped me once. I haven't forgotten that. But you spent 9 years building towards something you were never going to be given, and you did it by hurting people who had nothing to do with any of this. She glanced at the floor near his hand, at the sealed envelope that had skidded there. What's in the envelope? Cole said nothing. She walked to it. She picked it up and opened it. She read the single page inside and her face went very still. Not the controlled stillness she maintained, but a different kind. The involuntary stillness of a person absorbing something that has landed in a place that isn't defended. Damon watched her. What is it? She folded the page. She put it in her jacket pocket. She looked at the wall for a moment, at nothing, at the corrugated metal of the shipyard wall with its rust lines and its age. My father needs to see this, she said quietly. Not to anyone. Just a statement she needed to make out loud. She turned to Theo. Get him out of here. Legal transfer, everything documented, nothing informal. I don't want anyone in our structure near him after tonight. He goes to the authorities or he goes nowhere. She looked at Cole one last time. I'm sorry it went this way, she said, and it sounded true, which was perhaps the most complicated thing about her. Cole looked up at her and said nothing. She walked toward the loading bay. Damon fell into step slightly behind her, not by instruction but by instinct. The instinct of a man who no longer had a clear position in the geometry of a room and was defaulting to proximity with the person who did. Outside, the docks were cold and dark, and the water beyond the fencing moved with the slow indifference of deep water. 3 vehicles were running with their lights off. People moved with purpose and without urgency, the operation concluding the way serious operations concluded. Not with drama, but with the systematic removal of all evidence that the drama had occurred. Serena stopped walking. She stopped at the edge of the concrete where it gave way to the dock's edge, and she looked at the water for a moment with one hand in the pocket of her jacket, on the folded page. Damon stopped beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't have anything that was ready to be said. He stood in the cold and looked at the same dark water, and waited for whatever came next. The page, she said, without turning. It's a record. Something Cole was holding as insurance. She paused. It shows the identity of the person inside the organization who arranged the original assassination attempt against me, 9 years ago. Another pause. The person I was told was responsible. The person my father has believed all this time was responsible. That's not who it was. He turned his head to look at her profile. She was still looking at the water. Who was it? He said. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said the name in a low, even voice, and he didn't recognize it, which told him it was someone inside a world he'd never fully been part of, and the name landed on the cold dock air and sat there between them, and Serena's hand was still in her pocket on the folded page, and he could see in the set of her jaw, and the particular tension of her shoulders, that whatever this name meant, it meant something that was going to change the shape of the next conversation she had with her father in a way that neither of them was ready for. In the water below the dock, the current moved without caring about any of it. Somewhere behind them, inside the shipyard, Cole was being formally transferred to the custody of people with official standing to receive him, and the documentation of his operation was being gathered and sequenced, and the transmission he'd intended as a weapon was being processed by 3 federal correspondents who would spend the next several hours turning it into something public and irreversible. The machinery was still running. It would run for a while yet. But standing at the edge of the dock in the cold dark, with the name she'd just said still in the air between them, Serena Vale looked less like the heir to a criminal empire, and less like the woman who had walked out of his house with a gray suitcase, and more like a person who had climbed to the top of something very difficult, and was standing there looking at the view and finding it nothing like what she'd expected. Damon looked at her and said nothing, because there was nothing he could say that was adequate, and he was only beginning to understand the value of knowing the difference. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. She answered it immediately, and what she heard made her close her eyes for exactly 3 seconds before she opened them and said, "I'm on my way," and ended the call. She turned from the water. "My father," she said. "He's seen the transmission." "Is he all right?" "He's seen the name," she said. "The one I just told you." She looked at Damon with eyes that were very clear and very tired and carrying the specific weight of a person who has just been handed a problem that cannot be delegated or postponed or managed from a distance. A problem that requires her, specifically her, to walk into a room and say a true thing to someone she loved and watch it change. I have to go, she said. I know, he said. She started toward the vehicles. After 3 steps, she stopped without turning. The Castellan process, she said. The legal proceedings. I'll have someone contact Hale next week about a framework, something that doesn't require you to lose everything. A pause. Not because you've earned it, because it's the right way to close this. He looked at her back. Serena. She turned her head slightly. I'm sorry, he said, for the recordings, for all of it. I know it doesn't change anything. She looked at him over her shoulder for a long moment. The dock light was behind her and her face was in shadow, and he couldn't read her expression clearly, which was perhaps appropriate. No, she said. It doesn't. She walked to the vehicle and got in, and the door closed and the lights came on, and it moved away along the dock road. And Damon stood at the edge of the concrete in the cold and watched the red of its taillights diminish and disappear. And then he stood there a while longer with the water moving below him and the name she'd said still in the air, and the long, specific exhaustion of a man who has arrived at the far end of a week that has taken a decade's worth of assumptions and turned them over one by one to show what was underneath. It was not a comfortable view, but it was, for the first time in a long time, an honest one. He turned and walked back to his car through the empty shipyard, past the overturned table and the scattered documents, and the concrete floor where Renard Cole had lain, looking up at the woman he'd spent 9 years trying to outmaneuver. And the shipyard was empty now, and quiet, and the tide outside was doing what tides did, indifferent and ongoing, and Damon Voss got in his car and sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel before starting the engine. His phone buzzed. Hale. He answered. Petra's at the medical center, Hale said. She's fine, some dehydration, some shock. She'll be home tomorrow. He let out a breath. There's something else, Hale said. Tell me. The transmission. It's been picked up by 2 national outlets in the last 30 minutes. Cole is identified by name. The full conversation is transcribed. And there's a federal contact who wants to speak with you tomorrow morning. Not as a subject, as a witness. A witness. He looked through the windshield at the dark interior of the shipyard, at the shadows and the orange light and the machinery that had outlasted its purpose. 8 o'clock, Hale said. Can you make that? Yes, Damon said. He started the engine. The federal building at 8 in the morning had the particular quality of a place that processed human difficulty as a matter of routine. The fluorescent light, the laminate surfaces, the people moving through its corridors with the practiced neutrality of those who had learned to carry other people's worst moments without wearing them home. Damon sat in a conference room on the 6th floor with Marcus Hale beside him, and a cup of coffee he didn't drink going cold in front of him, and waited. The federal contact's name was Agent Reyes. She was younger than he'd expected, mid-30s, dark hair pulled back, a jacket that fit well, and a notepad that she used with the economy of someone who knew what was important before the person across from her did. She had a colleague who sat against the wall and said nothing, and whose function appeared to be witnessing. We're not here to discuss your financial exposure today, Reyes said. She said it first before anything else, which Damon understood was deliberate. A door opened before he'd thought to look for it. That's a separate proceeding and separate counsel. What we need from you this morning is the conversation. Walk me through it from the voicemail forward. He walked her through it. He was precise. He did not embellish and he did not minimize, and he gave her the sequence in the order it had happened, and Hale interrupted twice to clarify legal framing, and both times Reyes waited for the interruption to finish with the patience of someone who had learned that lawyers talked, and then the useful information resumed. When he finished, she wrote something on the notepad. The envelope, she said. The page inside it. Did you read it? No. Serena, read it. But she told you the content. She told me what it described, a record of the individual responsible for the assassination attempt 9 years ago. And the name she gave you. Hale put a hand on the table. We'd want to understand the relevance before. The name, Damon said to Reyes, and said it. Reyes wrote it down without reacting. She underlined it once. She looked at her colleague against the wall, and the colleague made a note of his own, and something passed between them that wasn't a word. That name, Reyes said carefully, is currently associated with an active proceeding in a different jurisdiction, I can't tell you more than that. But I want you to understand that what you've just given me is not a small thing." Damon looked at her. "Is Serena in danger?" Reyes looked at her notepad. "I think Serena Vale has demonstrated a considerable capacity for managing her own exposure," she said, which was not an answer, but was also not nothing. The meeting ran another 40 minutes. When it was done, Hale walked with him to the elevator and they stood waiting for it in the institutional corridor, and Hale said, in the voice he used when he was being honest rather than professional, "That went better than it had any right to." "Yeah," Damon said. "The financial proceedings will still be—" "I know what they'll be," Damon said. The elevator came. "Let's not talk about it today." Hale looked at him. "All right," he said. He went to the hospital next. Petra was in a private room on the 3rd floor, sitting up in the bed with a drip in her arm and a magazine she wasn't reading in her lap, and the particular look of a person who had been through something their nervous system was still catching up to. She had a bruise along her left jaw that hadn't been there the last time he'd seen her, and her eyes, when she looked at him from the doorway, were the eyes of a woman reassessing the landscape she'd been standing in. He sat in the chair beside the bed. He didn't say anything immediately, neither did she. "I'm sorry," he said. "You didn't take me," she said. "I know. I'm still sorry. The situation that made you a target, that's mine." She looked at the window. "They didn't hurt me," she said. "They were very clear about that. They said it repeatedly, like they needed me to know it was professional. I don't know if that's better or worse." She paused. "Who were they?" "People who wanted to use you to make me do something. It's over now." "Is it?" "The man responsible is in federal custody. It's over." She absorbed that. She turned the unread magazine over in her lap. "The woman," she said. "Your ex-wife. She's the one who found me." "Her people did." "She called me," Petra said, last night, after I was out. She called to make sure I was all right." She paused. "She didn't have to do that." "No," he agreed. "She didn't." Petra looked at him with the directness of someone who had spent 3 days in a room with nothing to do but think. "What happened between you two?" she said. "The real version, not the one you told me." He looked at his hands in his lap, at the knuckles, the skin, the unremarkable physical fact of hands that had signed documents and pointed at things, and gestured through conversations, and had never, in 5 years, reached for Serena Vale with any particular care. "I treated her like she was background," he said, "like she was decor, and I told myself that was acceptable because I decided she didn't have enough substance to deserve better." He looked up. "I was wrong about the substance. I was wrong about most of it." Petra was quiet for a moment. "She really is Lucian DeMarco's daughter." "Yes." "And you didn't know?" "No." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Damon," she shook her head once, "you always thought you were the most powerful person in every room." "I know." "You weren't. I know that now." She looked at the window again, at the flat morning light coming through the hospital glass, and her expression settled into something that was tired and honest and not unkind, but also not what it had been before the room and the drip and the 3 days of professional men telling her it wasn't personal. "I need some time," she said. Take whatever you need. I don't mean from you specifically. I mean from—" She gestured vaguely, which encompassed the room and the magazine and the drip and the bruise, and probably a number of other things he wasn't positioned to fully understand. "From all of it." "Okay," he said. He left her with the magazine and the window and the light. He drove home and walked through the house slowly, room by room, not looking for anything specific, just moving through the space with the altered perception of a man returning to a place that has been the same place the entire time, but that he is seeing for the first time without the particular distortion that money and arrogance applied to surfaces, making everything reflect back only what you already believed about yourself. The Italian marble was cold under his shoes. The chandelier threw its light at the same angles it always had. The oil painting of the coastline he'd never visited hung in the entryway exactly where it had always hung, and he looked at it for a while, at the painted water and the painted cliffs and the specific quality of expensive uselessness that had always appealed to him, buying the image of a place he'd never bothered to go to. And he took it off the wall and set it facing the baseboard and felt, in the small silence that followed, something shift fractionally. 3 weeks passed. The Castellan proceedings moved forward with the deliberate pace of legal machinery that had been built for endurance rather than speed. Hale negotiated. There were hearings and submissions, and the careful language of people who were reaching an arrangement that none of them would describe as a settlement, even though that was what it was. What Damon emerged with at the end of it was less than what he'd had and more than what Cole's scheme had been designed to leave him with. A single development project, fully his, unencumbered, in a neighborhood he'd always considered secondary, and that 2 analysts now told him was the next place money was going. The hotel group was gone. The financial district building was gone. The Carmel property was gone. The founding myth was gone, or at least it had been replaced by a more accurate story that he was not yet ready to tell publicly and might never be. He went to work on the remaining project with the specific focus of a man who has had everything clarified by subtraction. He showed up on site. He talked to the contractors, not over them. He learned the names of the project manager's assistants, which he had never done before, and found that they were more useful than the project managers in certain specific ways because they were the people who actually knew what was happening on the ground. He was on site on a Tuesday afternoon when his phone rang, and the name on the screen was not a name but a number, and the number was the one associated with the DeMarco attorney who had handled the settlement framework. He answered. "Ms. Vale would like to meet," the attorney said. "At your convenience. No specific agenda." He said Thursday. The attorney said Thursday was fine. The location was a restaurant, not a conference room. A small place in the neighborhood that Damon's remaining project was in. The kind of restaurant that had been there for 20 years, and that the new money hadn't found yet, and that still had paper menus and a lunch crowd that was mostly people who worked nearby. Serena was already there when he arrived. She was at a corner table with a glass of water and no phone on the table, which he noticed. She looked different from the shipyard, from the conference room. She was in a light jacket, and her hair was down, and she looked like a person who had slept in the last several weeks, which he was not entirely sure he could say about himself. He sat down. "How's the project?" she said. "Moving," he said. "Slower than I'd like." "They always are." The waiter came. They ordered, both of them simply, without the performance of choosing, which was different from every meal he could recall them sitting through together when she'd been his wife, and the restaurant had been a stage, and the menu had been a prop. "The name," he said, "the one on the page. Is that being handled?" She looked at her water glass. "It's being handled," she said. "It's complicated. The person involved is... It touches things inside the organization that take time to address correctly." She paused. "My father is dealing with it." "Is he all right?" Something crossed her face, brief and genuine. "He's finding out that someone he trusted for a very long time was not what he believed they were. So no. But he will be." Damon nodded. He turned his water glass in a small circle on the table. "I testified," he said. "Reyes, the federal contact. She told me afterward that the Cole case is connecting to something larger, a network, several jurisdictions." "I know," Serena said. "I've been briefed. Your name came up in the federal context, your role, what you know." "I've spoken with them. I have counsel. It's being managed." She said it without dismissiveness, just the clean factual delivery of someone who had prepared for this contingency a long time ago and was now executing the preparation. "The organization is going through a formal restructuring. My father announced it last week. I don't know if you saw it." "I saw it." He had. It had been a press release, formal, precise, the language of corporate governance applied to something that had never previously submitted to corporate governance. The DeMarco family interests were being reorganized under a legitimate holding company structure, with a compliance board and external oversight, and a named executive who would manage operations going forward. The named executive was Serena Vale, not the heir to a criminal organization, the CEO of a logistics and security corporation. The language had been careful, and the legal architecture behind it had clearly been years in preparation, and the press had covered it with the slightly dazed quality of journalists encountering a story they hadn't known to look for. "The helicopters," he said. She looked at him. "The day you left. The helicopters. That was deliberate." "Yes," she said. "You wanted it seen." "I wanted it recorded," she said. "I needed a documented public moment of separation. Something that established clearly and irrefutably that I had left your household under my own terms, with my own family's support, without coercion, and without accepting the conditions of the settlement as final. She paused. The $200,000 I accepted in the settlement was a legal trigger, but I needed the record to show that I hadn't accepted the characterization, that I hadn't walked out of that house as a woman with nothing, because that characterization was going to matter in subsequent proceedings. He looked at her. The helicopters were for the record. The helicopters were for several things, she said, but yes, among them. He thought about standing on the lawn watching Lucien DeMarco cross the grass toward her. He thought about the look on Lucien's face, not the look at Damon, which had been brief and dismissive, but the look at Serena, which had been the look of a man at the end of a very long wait. He missed you, Damon said. Serena's hand was on the table. She turned her water glass a quarter turn, the same motion he'd just made with his own without realizing, and he wondered if it was something people did when they were carrying something they weren't sure how to put down. He respected my choice to leave, she said. That's different from being all right with it. She paused. He knew why I left. He understood. But understanding a thing doesn't make the years shorter. The food came. They ate without filling the silence artificially, without the social performance of a lunch between people who wanted to appear comfortable. The silence was not comfortable. It was honest, which was different. Halfway through the meal, she said, "The recordings." He put his fork down. "I didn't place them," she said. "I want you to know that. The audio from the house, I didn't set that up. I didn't know it was happening." He looked at her. "Your father." "Security protocol," she said. "When I came back, certain measures were already in place that had been ongoing for some time. I found out about the recordings the same week you did, when the articles went out." She met his eyes. "I didn't choose to weaponize what you said to me. It happened around me, the way a lot of this happened around me." He thought about that. He turned it over. He could feel the shape of what it would mean if he used it. The small exoneration of believing that the most damaging thing hadn't been done to him deliberately, that it had been collateral, that there was a version of these events in which Serena Vale had not chosen to expose him, but had simply left and let the existing machinery operate. It didn't change what he'd said. It didn't change the way he'd said it, or who he'd said it to, or the laughter that had followed. "It doesn't matter," he said, "whether you place them or not. The recordings are accurate." She looked at him for a moment. She picked up her fork again. "Yes," she said. "They are." They finished the meal. The waiter brought coffee without being asked, which was one of the things about restaurants that had been there for 20 years. They drank it, and the afternoon light shifted through the window, and the lunch crowd thinned, and they sat in the quiet of a room that had stopped pretending. "The restructuring," Damon said. "The corporation. That's what you wanted, before any of this." "That's what I always wanted," she said. "I left the organization because I couldn't see a path toward it. There were people, Renard being one of them, who needed the organization to remain what it was, because what it was is where their power lived. The legitimization was always the threat to them. Not me specifically, the direction. And now Renard is in custody, and the people who aligned with him are being dealt with, and my father has formally transferred operational authority to the new structure." She paused. "It won't be clean. It won't be fast. There are years of work ahead of it, and I will make mistakes, and there will be people who resist it and try to exploit the transition." She looked at the table. "But it's real now. It started. That's different from a plan." "It's what you went quiet for 9 years to protect," he said. She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted fractionally, not softening exactly, but opening slightly, the way a door opens when the latch has been turned, even if the door itself hasn't moved yet. "When I left," she said slowly, "I was 22, and I had nearly been killed by people inside my own family, and I was tired in a way that I didn't have words for yet. I found quiet. I found a life that didn't have helicopters in it, or contingency plans, or rooms where everyone was managing everyone else." She paused. "And then I met you." He was very still. "And you were exactly the wrong kind of man," she said. "But you were also very far from anything I came from, and I thought—" She stopped. She looked at the table. "I thought that was enough of a reason." He said nothing for a moment. "Was it?" "For a while," she said. "And then it wasn't. And then I found the investment documents, and I understood what I'd actually walked into, and I had to decide whether to leave immediately or wait until the timing meant something." You waited 3 years. I waited until I understood the full shape of it, she said. Until I knew every thread and where it led. Until I knew that when I left it would close properly. Not just for me, but for the structure around it. She met his eyes. I'm sorry if the timing made it worse for you. He thought about whether to say the thing that was sitting in him. He decided to say it. Were you ever... He stopped, restarted. In the beginning, before you found the documents, was there any of it that was real? She held his gaze for a long moment. The kind of moment that had weight, that a person felt in the chest, that arrived without warning in the middle of a lunch at a restaurant with paper menus and answered a question you'd been carrying without knowing you were carrying it. Yes, she said. Some of it. He nodded. He looked at the table. He picked up his coffee, and it was nearly cold, but he drank it anyway. That's enough, he said. He meant it. She looked at him with the evaluating directness that was, he understood now, simply how she looked at things. Not coldness, not distance, but the clear-eyed appraisal of someone who had learned early that seeing things accurately was a survival skill and had never been able to turn it off. What are you going to do? She said. Going forward. Build the project, he said. The one I have left. Do it correctly this time, meaning I actually know where the money comes from. He looked at the window, at the street outside, at the neighborhood that was not yet what it was about to become. Tell the true story of how I started, eventually. When I can do it without it being primarily about me. She considered that. That's a different version of you than the one who was in that kitchen. Yes, he said. I think that's the point. The waiter brought the check without being asked for that either. Serena reached for it. Damon put his hand near it without taking it, and they looked at each other, and she let him pay, which was perhaps a small mercy and perhaps just practicality, and he paid it. They walked out together. On the sidewalk in front of the restaurant, the afternoon was clear and cool, the street busy with the specific energy of a neighborhood in the last period before it became something else. A delivery truck was double parked. Someone's dog was investigating the base of a planter. The ordinary world was conducting its ordinary business at full volume. The Carmel house, Damon said, before it transfers. I'd like to go once, to see it. She looked at him. I'll arrange it. Thank you. She nodded. She had her phone out the first time during the lunch, and she was looking at something on the screen with the returning attention of a person for whom the world had been accumulating demands during the 2 hours she'd spent in this restaurant. Serena, he said. She looked up. I hope it works, he said. The corporation, what you're building. I hope it's what you wanted it to be. She looked at him for a moment. I thought she was going to say something measured, something proportionate, the kind of response calibrated to the distance that still existed between them and that would always exist. But what she said was simpler than that. Me too, she said. She walked to the car that had been waiting at the curb, the same quiet, dark car, the same unhurried efficiency, and got in, and the car moved into the street and was absorbed into the traffic within half a block. He stood on the sidewalk for a while. He thought about Lucian DeMarco crossing the back lawn with his hand extended. He thought about Cassius in the motel room saying, "She's thorough, Damon. She has always been thorough." He thought about the recording, his own voice, unhurried, contemptuous, certain, and he let himself hear it again, not to punish himself with it, which would have been a form of self-indulgence, but to keep it accurate, to not let memory smooth it into something more tolerable than it had been. It had been what it had been. He had been who he had been. The distance between that and who he might become was not a gap that an apology closed or a good week bridged. It was the kind of distance you covered by moving, day by day, in a specific direction, and you found out over time whether you'd actually moved or whether you'd just told yourself a new story about standing still. He walked back to his car. He drove to the project site and put on the hard hat he'd started keeping in the back seat and walked the floors with the site manager, a woman named Grace, who had been doing this for 15 years and who had stopped being surprised by Damon's presence on site in the second week and had started talking to him like a person, which he took as a form of progress. The East Foundation has a variance, Grace said, pointing. Nothing structural, but it needs to be documented before we go to the next phase. Document it, he said. Already did. She handed him the tablet with the report on it. I'm showing you so you know, not so you can approve. He looked at the report. He handed the tablet back. Good, he said. She gave him a look that was not quite a smile, but was in that direction. He spent 2 hours on site. He knew the names of 3 workers he hadn't known 2 weeks ago. He ate a sandwich from the food truck that parked outside the site at noon, standing on the sidewalk with his hard hat in his hand, watching the street and eating without performing anything for anyone, which was a thing he'd almost forgotten how to do. In the weeks that followed, the Renard Cole proceedings moved through the legal system with the grinding, comprehensive momentum of a case that had federal involvement and multiple jurisdictions and more documentary evidence than most prosecutors saw in a year. Cole entered a plea 4 months later that his attorney described, in carefully worded public language, as a resolution in the interests of all parties. Damon was called to testify twice. Both times he said exactly what had happened in the order it had happened and did not add anything and did not subtract anything. And on both occasions, Reyes caught his eye briefly afterward with an expression that was not quite approval but was in its vicinity. The name from the envelope, the name Serena had given him on the dock at midnight, surfaced in public proceedings 6 weeks after the Cole plea, attached to a separate matter in a jurisdiction 2 states over. The full account of it was reported in 3 national outlets and 1 international one, and the reporting connected it to the assassination attempt 9 years ago with a specificity and documentation that suggested someone had been preparing the record for a long time. Damon read the coverage on his phone at the project site during a break and thought about Serena on the dock with her hand in her jacket pocket on the folded page, saying, "My father needs to see this." And he thought about Lucien DeMarco being handed the true name after 9 years of believing the wrong one. And he thought about what that kind of correction cost. The reopening of a thing you had processed and accepted. The discovery that the shape of it had been different from what you'd grieved. He sent a single text to the DeMarco attorney's number. It said, "I hope it's going all right." No response was expected. None came. 3 months later, on a Thursday morning with a low gray sky that smelled like incoming rain, he drove up the coast to the Carmel house. It had been arranged as she'd promised. A window of access, one afternoon, before the formal transfer completed. A property manager met him at the gate and gave him a key and showed him the current state of the place, which had been maintained impeccably, and then left him alone with it. He walked through the rooms. The house was the best thing he'd ever owned, or that he'd believed he'd ever owned, and it looked the way good things looked when they'd been properly cared for. Not new, not pristine, but solid. The beauty in the material itself rather than in performance. He stood at the window that looked down the cliff to the water for a long time. The water was dark green and textured in the wind. A bird worked the updraft along the cliff face. He thought about the story he'd told about this house at dinners, at panels, in magazine profiles. The founding myth. The scrappy self-made developer who bet on himself. He thought about the true version, the Luxembourg entity, the meetings with Cassius, the investment he'd taken without asking enough questions because the questions would have required him to know things about himself that he hadn't been ready to know. He was ready now. Or he was more ready than he had been. That was probably as much as you could say honestly. He stood at the window until the sky began to move and the light went from gray to a darker gray that meant rain was arriving, and then he walked back through the rooms, turned off the lights. He'd turned on, locked the door behind him, and left the key at the gate. He drove back to the city in the rain. The wipers moved steadily, and the road curved with the coastline, and the water appeared and disappeared on his left, dark and persistent, doing what water did. He had a meeting at 4 with Grace about the East Foundation documentation. He would be on time for it. He would listen to what she said, and he would respond to what she actually said, rather than to what he'd already decided, which was a skill he was building slowly and imperfectly, and with the specific awareness that slow and imperfect was what honest improvement looked like. The city appeared in the distance through the rain, its skyline gray and present and indifferent to who he had been, and open, in the way cities were always provisionally open, to who he was going to be instead. On the rooftop of the newly renamed DeMarco Global Headquarters across the city, on that same gray morning, Serena Vale stood with her jacket collar up against the wind and looked at the skyline and the rain coming in from the water, and felt the specific complicated feeling of a person at the beginning of the hardest thing they've ever chosen. The helicopters on the landing pad behind her were idle, their blades rested. They were not symbols of anything this morning. Not power, not arrival, not the sound of a life being reclaimed. This morning they were machines, tools, part of the logistics infrastructure of a company that moved things and protected things and did it legally and did it well, and was going to take years of work and will and the daily grinding patience of someone who had learned the hard way that wanting something to be different from what it was required more than the wanting. Her assistant appeared at the roof access door. "The compliance board is ready for you." "1 minute," she said. The assistant withdrew. She stood in the wind for that minute. She let the rain touch her face. She thought about a coffee shop 3 years ago and an old man named Cassius who had told her more than he'd intended to and less than she'd needed, and she had pieced the rest together herself, the way she'd pieced together most of the important things. Alone, patiently, without asking for help until she understood exactly what kind of help she needed and from whom. She thought about the gray suitcase, about 11 minutes of packing, about signing the papers without looking up, which was its own kind of answer to the way he'd signed them, and which she had known even then was the quietest possible statement she could make about what she'd learned to be worth. She turned from the view. She walked to the roof access door and opened it, and went inside and down the stairs to the room where the work was waiting. And she sat at the head of the table, and she opened the first document, and she began.